All right. Welcome to our March 2026 Abbeville Institute Zoom webinar. We will have Joe back with us in just a minute. He had to go get a cup of coffee. But we're very excited to have you here, of course. This topic is important and timely. It's Distorting the Declaration. We're going to talk about Harry Jaffa tonight. Of course, our conference coming up in the middle of March in Montgomery, Alabama is on the exact same topic. We asked Joe to come and present there, but he couldn't make it. So we figured we would do this, kind of a precursor to what we're going to do there. We still have an opportunity for you to sign up for that conference if you would like to come. The absolute cutoff date essentially is about a little over a week from now, but if you wanted to sign up as soon as possible, that would be great so we can have final numbers. But we still would love to have you come to Montgomery, particularly if you live around the area and you just want to come in and pop in for these sessions. Again, we're excited to have you for this webinar. If you don't know about the Abbeville Institute, if you're seeing this for the first time or have never heard about us before, the Abbeville Institute is a 501c3 nonprofit organization with a mission to explore what is true and valuable in the Southern tradition. I'm Brian McClanahan, the president of the organization, and we're excited to have you here. These are being recorded. They will be shown on YouTube or available on YouTube after it's over. So go on out and check that out. You will get a link to that. If you want to ask questions, please do so. You can either use the chat button at the bottom where you can, and I'm going to set that to where everybody can participate. So everyone can now, I believe I've got that set right. If I don't have that set, let's see. There we go. Now everybody can chat there. The Q&A button should be working as well. So go ahead and use that Q&A button if you want to ask questions. It is a great way to let us know what you want to talk about. We're joined tonight, of course, by Joe Stromberg. He has been affiliated with the Institute for years. We've had him at conferences. He's written some really great stuff on imperialism, the Constitution, also on country music, which is fantastic. So he was a participant in our 1607 project. So we're excited to have him on here talking about Harry Jaffa and the distortion of the Declaration of Independence. And so I'm going to turn it over to Joe, and he's going to talk for about 20 or 25 minutes. Then we will field questions. So please feel free to ask those questions either in the chat window or in the Q&A button. So, Joe, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, well, thank you, Brian. Well, this is called Harry v. Jaffa and the Declaration of Independence and Conservatism. So we start with Jaffa. He lived from 1918 to 2015, studied at Yale, got a BA in 1939, earned his PhD at the New School of Social Research in 1951, taught at Ohio State and Claremont McKenna College in California, and founded the Claremont Institute. Excuse me. He has a mob of disciples at Claremont, also at the University of Dallas, Hillsdale College, and elsewhere, who are collectively called the West Coast Straussians. He wrote at least 6 books, edited many collections of essays, and wrote hundreds of essays, some very long and some short. He also wrote speeches for Barry Goldwater in 1964 and wrote the famous lines, "Extremism in defense of liberty is no vice, and moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue," although Karl Hess also claimed to have written one of those. Okay, now this brings us to Leo Strauss, who directed Jaffa's dissertation on Thomas Aquinas at the New School. Strauss was a German Jewish philosopher who had fled National Socialist Germany. He focused on how philosophy fell from the heights of Plato and Aristotle, but later made a partial recovery in recent centuries. In their work of recovery, Strauss and his followers read very deeply into a short list of philosophers. They praise Plato and Aristotle, leap over medieval Christians in favor of their Jewish and Islamic contemporaries, finally landing on Machiavelli, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, and Nietzsche. They treat most other philosophers as probable enemies. They're always hunting for esoteric teachings. This is quotation marks, teachings. And they get unconvincing results, I would say. Now, Jaffa himself became a power. And he undertook to remake American conservatism in Lincoln's image with much success. And his West Coast Straussian heirs now provide much of the brainpower claimed by the present conservative movement. They adopted Donald Trump in 2016, and in 2020, he let them write his abortive 1776 report, intended to refute the 1619 project with real American history based on Jaffa. Such efforts have been destructive of both conservatism and American historical writing. Crucial are Jaffa's claims that the Constitution implicitly contains and fulfills 5 little words in the Declaration, the proposition that all men are created equal. In his telling, Abraham Lincoln is the equal of Plato and Aristotle and understood this proposition and made it his creed. He vindicated it in the costliest war ever fought in North America. It is therefore our duty to believe and defend Lincoln's project. Since the Declaration apparently restates the timeless wisdom of the philosophers found on the Straussian shortlist, those ideas constitute the real America and dictate our national purpose and must therefore be central to American conservatism. This idea of a propositional nation conflicts with the ethno-nationalism of part of Trump's coalition, but MAGA is big, wide, and incoherent. So now we go to the first book in which Jaffa launched his project. It's The Crisis of the House Divided, published in 1959. In a 1982 preface, he stressed the role of Strauss's natural right and history in his work in recovering the tradition on which Lincoln somehow drew. Jaffa saw his book as reconstructing the debates in which Lincoln and Douglas effectively repeated the contest between Socrates and Thrasymachus in Plato's Republic. If Lincoln had not existed, wrote Jaffa, we would have had to invent him. And indeed, he did invent a Lincoln. Okay. Now, Jaffa claims to apply Thomas Aquinas's stepwise method of argument in deciphering Lincoln and the debates and Lincoln's writings. And in a way, he is doing that, but I don't think the results are very good. Jaffa was very concerned that wicked revisionists like J.G. Randall and George Fort Milton and others had set off a crisis by speaking of a needless war in the 1860s. He admits some good traits in Douglas, such as Jacksonian nationalism, as opposed to Calhoun, who sought, quote, the consolidation of Southern nationalism, which is utter nonsense because Calhoun was always trying to save the Union, but not unconditionally. Jaffa has a good grasp of the factional views and legislative history involving the Kansas-Nebraska struggle. He sees the repeal of the Missouri Compromise as the sine qua non of civil war. Well, that's only if you go to war when some of these results come in. Lincoln praised Jefferson, who, in his words, in the fight for national independence by a single people, introduced an abstract truth. He adds that, quote, Jefferson intended the Declaration, or the philosophy in it, to have a far more dramatic consequences than were possible in 1776. Now, at this point, he introduces Lincoln's 1838 Lyceum address, where Lincoln treated the topics of mob rule and the danger of a towering genius like Caesar who might overthrow the system. And Lincoln's cure was a political religion, as Jaffa puts it. Lincoln's dramatic reversals in the speech naturally hid higher truths. He saw himself as playing the highest political role. He would be greater than Caesar by saving the Republic. And he was preparing for the crisis he foretold all his life. As such, he stood outside the system or the political order, but his political religion would save things if America adopted it. Lincoln aimed to cure mob violence and recommended cold, calculated, unimpassioned reason. Unlike the Federalists who had settled for a balancing act where ambition offset other ambitions. In his temperance address, Lincoln condemned all the reformers, the old ones and the new ones. And Jaffa analyzes his bait and switch tactics in the address, concluding that Lincoln foresaw, quote, that mind, all conquering mind, shall live and move the monarch of the world, end of quote. So now Lincoln has become Emerson, Whitman, or somebody. Okay. Jaffa also denounces Allen Nevins for apparently approving of Douglas's squatter sovereignty, the idea that the inhabitants of Kansas should be able to vote on whether slavery should come in their Constitution, which Congress would then have to approve. Lincoln said slavery was wrong everywhere and denounced Douglas, Taney, Pierce, Buchanan as conspirators. It had to be all one thing or the other. He also raised the prospect of slavery being restored in the free states once the Supreme Court had found Section 8 of the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional. So he discusses bleeding Kansas, the Lecompton Constitution, and border ruffians. There apparently were no ruffians on the other side. He doesn't mention John Brown. Okay, he returns to Lincoln's central theme of a nation founded on a proposition and argues that the founders themselves knew that they had based the Declaration on John Locke's second treatise. Excuse me. Now, the Declaration had a transcendental goal, which Lincoln transcended. For him, a just civil society is constituted by the movement toward actual equality, whereas Jefferson himself was too rebellious, and Lincoln improved on Jefferson's low ideas. The Straussians are always talking about low and high ideas, okay? And Jaffa conceives that Lincoln was logically, if not historically, right in his reconstruction of the founders' intentions. So here Jaffa seems to admit that Lincoln knew he was making stuff up. Now Jaffa turns to a pseudo-realist analysis of Lincoln's writings. And he says, Lincoln denied that we were a nation only because of the Constitution. At Gettysburg, quote, he carefully placed the birth in the year 1776 to go with the Declaration. And the Constitution's life principle, therefore, was the proposition. And then he says the Constitution and Union were only, quote, the formal causes of nationhood, but the Declaration's central proposition was its final cause. So here he's abusing Aristotelian and Thomistic philosophy. I've never read a Thomist who would probably buy this argument. There may be some now, but maybe they read Jaffa first. Okay. Jaffa admits that Douglas is right to predict that Lincoln's views might lead to war, but Lincoln, quote, would not be frightened from his policy by threats of war. Anyway, the South had changed its view on slavery, and all of this justified the destruction of the Confederacy by war. Jaffa even claims that Lincoln and Aristotle probably agreed on slavery, but alas, the manuscript is missing, and Aristotle's further thoughts are unavailable. So this is Jaffa speculating. Lincoln stood for government of, by, and for people dedicated to a certain proposition. Lincoln thought that in a free society, law must express the moral conviction of the people. Jaffa complains that people object that Lincoln didn't believe his own ideas. He made racist remarks and cultivated racist free soil votes. But Lincoln couldn't blow up the Republican Party. He had to be careful. Lincoln's got a balancing act he has to perform. And so his indirection and dishonesty is okay with Jaffa because he had this mission. So by the Declaration on Jaffa's account, unanimity in ratifying it or voting for the Declaration begat authority and established civil society. And this is why so many Straussians today write books on social contract theory, which they interpret in Jaffaite fashion. Okay. Jaffa admits that Lincoln offered no social equality for blacks, but adds that Lincoln said nothing about the future. Who knows? He might have dreamed that in the future it would be different. He also attacks the argument by the revisionists that there were natural limits to slavery expansion. And here Jaffa probably has a point, as Genovese has argued, but not in reference to Jaffa. Lincoln reasoned that confining slavery to where it existed would end American imperialism. No need to bother the South Americans. Now, this is interesting, but it dodges the fact that we really embarked on our South American imperialism after slavery was abolished. So you can't have it both ways. Now, there's a final Thomistic train wreck in a note on page 425, and I'll read the whole thing. This is Jaffa. The soul is the form of the body, hence its formal cause. The function of the soul, that is rational activity, is the final cause. Strictly speaking, not the principle that all men are created equal, but the activity which it engenders and the hope which it plants in the hearts of all. That is the final cause of the American polity. That's the end of the quote. So again, I think he's not really a very good Thomist, but that would take another whole section that I haven't written. Okay. Okay, so let's assess the book. Had Lincoln never become a president who presided over a monstrous North American war, the Lincoln-Douglas debates might have remained a local curiosity, a footnote to Midwestern or Illinois history. Yet Jaffa managed to ground a whole national civil religion on Lincoln's electioneering platitudes and some of his select speeches and writing. Earlier nationalists had poisoned the well by claiming that a nation sprang up out of nowhere on July 4th, 1776, and by reading historical documents on that assumption. Jaffa tied a bow around this nationalist dogma and made the conservative movement dumber than it was before. His promise of a sequel to be called A New Birth of Liberty was not fulfilled until 2000. And I've looked at that book, and it's more of the same stuff, but a lot more of it. And in that book, he tries to rebut every so-called neo-Confederate argument he's ever seen. Let's see where we are now. And reaffirmed ideologically by World War II and the Cold War, the Lincolnian nationalist settlement now shows signs of the stress that accompanies America's perpetual wars and unacknowledged world empire. Like Yates's center, Mr. Lincoln's abstract propositions cannot hold. Insisting on a primordial America with a singular national people and sovereignty has caused a lot of trouble. Now, I'll say a few things about Jaffa himself. On a good day, Jaffa could seem amusing and agreeable unless one of his pet ideas was at stake. Then he could be arbitrary, capricious, polemical, and nasty. Occasionally, one of his judgments seems quite sound, but rather unexpectedly. When he wasn't slandering his opponents, he could be congenial. Perhaps this is how he and Mel Bradford could remain friends despite their disagreement on all these questions. Jaffa specialized in reading text closely. He would have made a good literary critic. His habit of finding what he wanted in a text made his history somewhat suspect. So I can conclude that Americans have been taught to believe in a Redeemer nation consciously founded on a teleological plan. As a result, J.G.A. Pocock, a famous historian of republicanism, could write that, quote, to suggest that there were no promises and no covenant would be to strike at the heart, end of quote. Yet it may be time for Americans to rethink mythical foundings and resultant world missions. If not, we may soon have no country, no money, no prospects, nor will we have conserved much at all. That's what I've got.
Okay, excellent. So let's talk a little bit about this situation of the Declaration. And I think it's fundamental to our understanding of American history. And I think Jaffa has more than anyone else changed the way Americans think about the Declaration. He's an impactful person, even if we don't want to admit that. And
Right.
Clyde Wilson and I have had conversations about this, and he says, the only reason Jaffa was anything is because Mel Bradford desired to debate him. I think, that debate in the 1970s was important, but of course, Jaffa was also taking on people like Wilmore Kendall. And he wasn't around really to debate Jaffa at that point, so somebody had to do it. But how do you? I mean, looking at the modern conservative movement, do you see any way forward with this notion of the Declaration not being foundational? I wrote an essay for Chronicles about 5 years ago now, and I was viciously attacked by the West Coast Straussians because I said the Declaration is not essentially a foundational document other than the last paragraph, which it is, but the rest of it is, the Federalists didn't like it. The old Republicans ultimately rejected it. The South rejected it. So you had this very small group of individuals like Henry Clay, John Quincy Adams, Daniel Webster, that took that second paragraph and ran with it. And of course, Lincoln, being a national Republican more than anything else, took it too. But he didn't even think the Gettysburg Address was that good, and so other people said the same thing. So how do we turn this back in so many ways? I mean, what's your assessment of that?
Well, I guess we have to convince people that the Declaration is mainly an indictment of the king and secondarily Parliament. They didn't want to directly address Parliament, I guess. But in any case, it's an indictment of the king to show why, under English law or natural rights, which they tended to conflate, they thought they were much the same. We had some rights that were being trampled on, and we weren't going to put up with it. So we were going to 13 colonies, or their lower houses, really, the revolutionary governments of 13 colonies were saying we're not taking it anymore, and we're staking our lives on independence. It's a wager of sorts, maybe. And the propositional bit was added or is there, just to tie it into Lockean theory, which many people knew and had read. It wasn't saying that we had a world mission to inflict our view of that on the world later or anything. It didn't even tell you that there was a union. I mean, look, if you look at Jefferson's autobiography, as he called it, he gives an account of the Declaration. And then the next section, he takes up how in August 1776 they met to discuss some kind of confederation. Well, if there was one union that instantly came into being on July 4th, he wouldn't need to do that. Why are they negotiating a confederation? So that's what occurs to me right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's that is a good question. You know, why would, and this is James Wilson, who created his own declaration later on. He said, you know, we didn't vote by colony, we voted as individuals, as one people. And, you know, he's got his own fake news of the 18th century. So you certainly had a push even right then to say the Declaration is something else.
Well, I think New York delayed the whole thing because they hadn't had instructions.
Right. So how is this? How is it? Yeah. How do you have one people when New York is not even voting at first? They're abstaining in the first vote. So
one thing that's lost in all these accounts, Jaffa or all these accounts, is agency. Nobody realizes these guys weren't just great geniuses proclaiming their will. They were sent there by their constituents, who were these state legislatures, and they had to report to them. I mean, John Adams once referred to the Continental Congress as a group of delegates from the states, which is one thing he got accurate for once.
Yeah, ambassadors, I think is the term that he used. They were ambassadors.
That was the word, yes.
Yeah,
that's right.
Ambassadors. So if they're ambassadors, that's foreign countries approaching each other and having a conversation about what we should do. And you know, so thinking about Jaffa and Strauss, and a lot of people ask me this, and you mentioned Strauss and the influence of Leo Strauss on Harry Jaffa. Could you just, you know, speak about Strauss for a couple of minutes, because that's something that comes up a lot. Can you tell us about Leo Strauss? What is Leo Strauss? How does he fit in this entire thing? Because Strauss is a huge figure, not just for Jaffa, but for others too. I mean, there's other Straussians besides the West Coast Straussians. So what role does Strauss have in American conservatism at all? I mean, if you can speak to that.
Well, okay, it's a process of infiltration, but okay, Strauss is educated in Germany. He was very close to Carl Schmitt, who was a Catholic authoritarian lawyer who was able to work with the Nazis because he wasn't Jewish. Okay, and then probably like everybody else, I mentioned that Strauss had to have known Heidegger. He knew Hannah Arendt. He knew that whole group of top-rate German Jewish intellectuals, and then some of the German intellectuals who were Christian or in background. He knew all these people, and he was influenced by the authoritarianism of Schmitt. But then he has to become a refugee because the National Socialists come to power. So he comes to New York, and he's accepted at the new school where all the refugees went and were teaching. And he had to shoot colossal background. I mean, to do what he did, he had to have read ancient Greek, Latin, medieval Arabic, medieval Hebrew, Renaissance Italian, French, German, Spanish, probably half the known languages in the world, really. He was a linguist like Eric von Kuhnert-Ledeen. He knew these languages. And now to lay in another bit of background. From about 1920 onwards, there was an attack coming from within the academic world against scientific materialism and pragmatism and all those tendencies. and it was centered at the University of Chicago under Robert Hutchins, president. And some of this work was led by Mortimer Adler, who was a Jewish Aristotelian philosopher, but they didn't discriminate. Thomists and Catholics could participate in this restatement of ancient philosophy along Thomistic lines. So, since Strauss has a colossal background in all these things, when he's accepted at Chicago, they think he's doing the same thing they are. And only until it's too late do they realize he's got a different agenda, which is to find the secret teachings so that the philosophers can ascend to philosophy and then they can advise the rulers. Nothing democratic about it at all. So that's some of the background that I can think of off the top of my head. And then he does proliferate. He has Alan Bloom. He has the East Coast Straussians. There was a gang at Toronto. There was a bunch at Cornell. Maybe Chicago itself, where he was teaching. I suppose they had to be some of them there. And eventually gets Jaffa, who undergoes training with Strauss, goes to California, and then he differentiates the West Coast Straussians on certain points. I mean, somebody like Harvey Mansfield, who must be 100 if he's still around, he reads Machiavelli in such a way that Mansfield comes out sounding more like a Hobbesian, and Jaffa wants to put his money on Locke as a more plausible guy to promote. So there's that kind of difference. But yeah, I didn't really know we had to worry about Straussians until around 2002. Well, I'd heard of them, I knew they were there. Murray Rothbard, when he was writing in the early 90s before he died, he said he thought there were 300 in the world. By now, there must be a lot more than that.
Well, they're everywhere. And I mean, the problem is that people are being influenced and they don't even know it. You go anywhere and you can see Jaffa in the conservative ink, mainstream conservatism. It's all there.
Well,
and people don't even realize it's happening.
Well, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, I may be talking out of turn. I don't think I am. But in 2006, my late wife, Mary, and I were in Dallas, and we had lunch, about a 3-hour lunch with Louise Cowan, who was the co-founder with her husband at the University of Dallas. And she said the worst mistake they ever made was hiring Wilmer Kendall, because he was a semi-Straussian. And then once the door was open, the Straussians have taken over several departments at Dallas. And two of the most, let's see, what is it? Thomas West and Richard Pistritto are two of the main Straussians at Dallas. And they're constantly turning out book after book. I've got a couple right here of essays in which it's all about social contract. The social contract is exactly what Jaffa said it was. And this should rule our lives. And then they refute every alleged Confederate or conservative argument. And they say, well, the problem with Jefferson Davis is he was thymotic. He was too spirited. Taking that from Plato's psychology, his three-part model of psychology. And a lot of us, some of it seems remarkably silly to me, but they've got an industry putting out these books of essays. And of course, West wrote the book, which was called Defending the Founders or something. This was a big splash back in the 90s. And one reviewer was so confused by it, he couldn't tell if he was defending the founders or defaming them.
Well, I mean, that's important to understand. And like I said, these people are pervasive. They don't even know they're parroting Harry Jaffa when they do it. But you do have the people that are true believers, and it's a very strange cult in some ways. I mean, when you listen to some of these people, they'll say things like, my teacher, Harry Jaffa, says this, and my teacher, Harry Jaffa, says that. It's a very strange thing to me, because nobody that I've ever met runs around saying my teacher, whoever your advisor was in graduate school or when you were getting in, that my teacher says this. It's a cult in so many ways. They
do like that word teaching. Yeah. Well, I remember in the 80s, the big thing in the late 80s was the Alan Bloom book, Closing the American Mind. It was like a conservative bestseller. And it's an absurd book.
Well, these people are very absurd in their own way. One of the things that, of course, I'm always fascinated with when you bring up to the Straussians, the Jaffaites, more importantly, the West Coast Straussians, the Jaffaites, that somehow, and Jeff Dice has corrected me and said now that they've moved to Texas, are they West Coast Straussians still? I don't know, but
they are spiritually.
Yeah, right. So these people don't really. The problem of Lincoln is something that I think, and who was Lincoln in the 1850s and 60s is something they really can't address, and that is that of course Lincoln was no conservative in 1858 or 1859. Certainly, he was somebody who was more moderate than some of the more radicals out of New England, but he wasn't really conservative. And the left, I think, is correctly, and Heather Cox Richardson correctly claims Abraham Lincoln as hers. I mean, that is her person. I mean, when she thinks about a political leader, it's Abraham Lincoln. And I don't think the West Coast Straussians can ever reconcile this, that what they're actually doing is championing the same person and the same principles that the left does. And so how do you stop the revolution if you're advocating the revolution? And they do this all the time.
Yeah, well, you have the there's a volume put out by international publishers, which was the Communist Party of America Press, and letters of Marx and Engels, and in there you find Marx is writing letters to Lincoln and he's advising him or trying to have influence, and they're all for it because they've got this category of the bourgeois revolution, and the bourgeois revolution is always good, and it's good because it's going to install capitalism, which we're going to hate, but that brings us one step closer to overthrowing that. So every mode of production is progressive. So a lot of the Marxists are absolutely committed to the bourgeois revolutions, whether however bloody they are. I mean, the French Revolution, the disaster, they like that, and so on. They're lukewarm in the American Revolution, and one part of the left is turned against the American Revolution, of course. But that's a later story.
Well, there's a question here. Is there any way for the old right, the paleocons, to ever take over this definition of conservatism? Is there a path forward? I've wrestled with this too. I don't know what your thought on it is, but in some ways, I'm not certain if we can. I mean, until we get more influence somewhere. But at this point, it's very difficult because the Jaffaites are so entrenched. And because the Claremont Institute became important in the Trump administration, it's going to be even harder. Mm-hmm. Do you think there's ever a path forward for this?
I don't know. There are days when I think probably humor. If we could write parodies of their stuff,
Yeah, I mean that would be a good way to do it. But I don't know if people would get it. When I ask questions on social media where I want them to focus on one particular thing, it just goes over their head. An example today, I was asking about, if we'll just, put this out. And I know the West Coast Straussians on foreign policy. Look, we agree with them on some things. But when you ask a question, if, Obama or Biden had launched this war in Iran and done so without the consulting Congress, done so unilaterally, would you still support it? For conservatives? And they all jumped right in to say yes, because it's Iran, but they missed the whole part of if it was done unilaterally without the Constitution. So would you still support it? And I can almost guarantee you that most of them would have whined, because they did when Obama launched attacks into Syria and other places. So they complained about that. But here, because it's their guy, they won't. And I think that's the thing about Lincoln. They do the same thing with Lincoln. Well, we're going to complain about X, Y, and Z in presidential powers. But when Lincoln does it, it's okay because it was justified. And you talked about the anti-Southern sentiment. You've got Larry Arnn that stands up and he'll do this at Hillsdale. He'll talk about all these great things. Then you get to Calhoun. He's the ultimate boogeyman in American history. They have to have somebody that is the bad guy. And it's always going to be the great triumvirate of Jefferson Davis, John C. Calhoun, and George Wallace. Those three people have to be bad. So, and you have to have the good guy that would counter those people. So I think that's one of the problems of this Straussianism. It's very black and white in so many ways. So I don't know what you think about that, but I mean, it's something that I see on a regular basis.
Oh, yeah. Well, another part of this is that Straussians like to put all our enemies in one basket. So if you don't agree with him, you're a historicist, or you're a relativist. Actually, a historicist just means you're trying to do a decent history. Yeah. See, but they'll accuse Calhoun being a Kantian. I don't think Calhoun paid a bit of attention to
He
Kant.
didn't. No, there's no evidence that Calvin ever read Kant. It's not
And
even there.
or they'll say that he's implicitly a Hegelian. It's all the guys, all the people they don't like, they'll just throw the Southerners in that pot.
Same thing. There's no evidence he ever read Hegel. So, I mean, I don't know how they get away with. I mean, they do it on a regular basis, but
well, they've done it, and now their followers have accepted it, and it is a difficulty. But really, all these incompatibles probably don't really coexist, which is part of their system, though, is to say everything they don't like is kind of the same thing, or two or three things they don't like. So,
yeah. I'm looking at questions here. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, partly they're just been very good at marketing, I guess.
I think that's true. And of course, they're just like the neocons in one way, in that they figured out how to get into power. I mean, the neocons hung around in Washington, D.C. Nobody liked them, but they hung around there. And eventually they figured out how they can weasel their way into the Reagan administration. And they worked their magic there. And the West Coast Straussians have done the exact same thing with Trump. He needed people in 2016, after he wins the election, to come in and fill out all these positions. And the West Coast Straussians were ready and eager to do it. And I think that's also, if you have that kind of influence, it does matter on your eventually your projection on what you can do.
Well, there's also a category of semi-Straussians. I mean, somebody like Bill Kristol, probably Jonah Goldberg, all these National Review guys, they're at least semi-Straussians. They're acquainted with it and they think it's all right. Mm-hmm. And during the Second Gulf War, it was amazing how many of the neocons had some interest in Straussianism. Not all of them, just quite a few did. So they find it compatible with their philosophy of denounce the enemy as Hitler or Calhoun and then blow them up,
It's sophomoric, but I mean, there's no nuance. Again, it's as you said, the basket of enemies. They just got to be placed in there. No. Question: what do you think is the best way to push back against this against liberals who obsess over the Proposition Nation or the Jaffa for normal people that are on social media or other things? How do you push back against it with that?
I'm really not sure. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I've been deliberately avoiding the Ken Burns program on the American Revolution. I'm not sure I'm ready for it, but there's so much myth attached to the American Revolution now by the part of the left that still thinks they can use it. It's just sort of like, Clyde Wilson's essay on the changing fortunes of Jefferson. Everybody wanted to use him up until about 1990 or thereabouts. And suddenly Jefferson was out because Connor Cruz O'Brien attacked him, and everybody said, well, if Jefferson was a slaveholder and a racist, we didn't know that, did we? And suddenly Jefferson's out because they don't want to hear about other things he said about decentralization and all of that. I really don't know how you get around that. I mean, I'm certainly willing to think about it. But basically, we had a war for independence, a war of secession, if you will. And we achieved what we got. And none of what happened later was predetermined. It didn't make anything into one nation. It didn't even make it into anything stronger than the Articles of Confederation until some ambitious people did that. And even they didn't get all that they wanted. So the whole thing is ambiguous. They call a convention to amend the articles, and then they get there, and of course they decide to write a new one, a new constitution. And that's irregular, but they got away with it, and it wasn't the worst thing I guess they could have done. But to make it this kind of inevitable unfolding. Okay, let's see. John William Burgess, if you know him, he's Tennessee Unionist, and he became the founder of American Hegelian political science. So he used Hegelianism to prove that all this had been inevitable, and the Union had to triumph, and it had to be the Union, and all of that. He's making the same arguments the Straussians make, but then hate him for being a Hegelian. So once again, I don't know how they square these things.
Yeah. Let's see. We have a question. Let's see. What should I respond to people who say Chief Justice Taney was the worst Chief Justice because of the Dred Scott v. Sanford decision? And that's a common argument. Taney was terrible because he issued this decision based on a political position. And he, of course, conversed with Buchanan beforehand. They thought this would settle the problem ultimately. And so he is the worst Chief Justice. I could say some positive things about Taney. I know this is often a stain on his record, but what do you say about that?
Well, Taney is complicated. Well, one thing people forget is that he's a Jacksonian nationalist. He absolutely believes you can't leave the Union. That's an admission that's never mentioned. Although when people did leave the Union, he sympathized with the South, but then he would. But he thought that I think his motive in making the decision, he thought he could clamp down all the controversy over Kansas, and it was a mistake. And in some ways, the decision it's got legal problems too, I believe.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, look, it's the entire substantive due process issue.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a problem with that decision. So we could critique the decision all day, but I don't want to steal your thunder. Go ahead. I know you were going to say more.
Well, yeah, and then people who've never read it. I mean, I think I read it in the 12th grade, the whole decision, but to see what it said. I mean, he never said it was his personal opinion that a black man had no rights a white man was bound to respect. He thought it was the result of all the colonial legislation he'd read, and even some later legislation. He wasn't giving out as his personal opinion, but I guess he was trying to build up to the argument that blacks were not citizens. Now, there is a flaw in that you've got, in some states, you had blacks in the militia. I think even South Carolina enrolled blacks in the militia in the Revolution. And that's usually a test of citizenship if you've borne arms for the country. But then it was forgotten in some places, and other places where they abolished slavery early, blacks were citizens, but they weren't treated very well, but they were citizens. And so you can't quite make the argument he made that they couldn't be, because they were in some states. So I don't know. He just overplayed his hand, and I think he had decent intentions. But I mean, you look at a life of Taney, you will see that in church he didn't pull rank. If he's in the Catholic Church and there's black people ahead of him, he doesn't bow in line, because before God, everybody's equal.
Mm-hmm.
He understood that.
Yeah. And, his decisions on civil liberties, of course, were great during the war. But, I think Taney, of course, his statue came under attack. But anyways, Taney is one of these figures that, again, is easy to demonize because of Dred Scott. But I think that comes down to a simplistic understanding of the entire situation. And what's going on there, and of course the decision itself, and as you said, what he was trying to do. He was looking for everyone focus on the Supreme Court. Can the Supreme Court just settle the issue? So he tried, and it was unpopular, and it caused more dissent.
Well, this is an argument for not encouraging the court to solve political problems.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. And of course, go back to the old Republicans, and they would say things like this all the time. The court can't do this. We need, and look, the state courts had actually ruled and it made decisions that Taney would oppose. So if the state courts had just handled the issue, it never would have been an issue. So that's the other situation.
Well, that's the other problem with Taney. Not only is he a Jacksonian nationalist, he's a Federalist.
Yeah,
he's in the line of John Marshall.
Exactly. He's a Supreme Court supremacist, which when you think, and I know that sounds like that's what that means, but when you go back and look at, again, the old Republican arguments against it, John Taylor, who you're very familiar with.
Yeah.
John Taylor, of course, in Construction Construed says, look, you can't have the supremacy clause means that the Constitution is supreme, because it says it, not the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court can't be supreme over everything, because then it becomes supreme. Yeah, and it's only supreme over the federal courts, not state courts, because the Congress doesn't create state courts. So this is a whole nother sphere of power.
Yeah, that clause was introduced by Thomas Burke of
Yeah,
North Carolina, and he was certainly a friend of the states.
right.
And
So it just doesn't make any sense for, again, the court to get involved in these kind of things because it just creates more conflict. And we see it all the time.
oh yeah,
Uh,
well,
let's see.
Brown versus Board. I mean, there's no end to it.
Right. I mean, anytime, because it's just going to be over and over. You're always going to have, another decision based on that decision, et cetera, et cetera. And what the old Republicans would say is, yes, you're going to get constructions that are conflicting, right? You're going to get one state has a construction that's different from another state, but then the ultimate source then has to be the people to decide through an amendment or some way to settle the problem outside of the courts, because what the courts are in essence doing is amending the Constitution without amending the Constitution,
Well,
and that creates problems.
yeah, you saw that book about 4 years ago, defending Spencer Run, with some of his decisions in the appendix of the book. That was quite useful.
Yes.
I wish people knew more about him in that Virginia school.
Spencer Roan is one of my favorite individuals to talk about, and of course, his long essays, 5 essays on the lottery decision in 1821 are just absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, yeah. Plus, he had a tendency to ignore the Supreme Court when he could.
Yeah, I mean, and he's married to Patrick Henry's daughter, so he knew something about Virginia. Of course, John Taylor of Caroline, examined him for the bar. So it's the man understood this Virginia school. But Stephen asked, did Jaffa acknowledge that Virginia and several other colonies had declared independence on their own before July 1776? And if he ever does that, how does it fit his narrative?
Well, if he covers that, it will be in the later book. It will be in, where'd it go? It's over here. The New Birth of Freedom. This one. It'll be in here and he did try to cover all these bases, so he probably does do that in here. I don't remember that he does, but I need to go back and reread it. I don't know. It's sort of like, when John Burgess, again, the Hegelian political scientist who taught at Columbia University from 1876 to about 1920 something, he said that, but it was the spirit of the one people acting at the Constitutional Convention, and if they had wanted to, they could simply have declared their document in force. They didn't have to send it to the states. That's the kind of nationalism you get from these guys. And Jaffa, I believe, takes a similar position in this later book of his, that it's like a French Revolutionary Assembly to him or something. Very weird.
Well, I think that's the effort by the profession overall to link the French Revolution with the American War for Independence. And, look, you can't ignore the fact that members, even in the old Republican school, as John Taylor said at one point, we all kind of flirted with these principles that Jaffa would say were part of the Declaration. They thought about these things, but then they woke up and realized this will be disastrous for us long term. So they eventually turned heel and said, we're not doing that. I was just reading some James Monroe today, and he uses the term social contract for the Union. Some of these terms floated around. You can find stuff if you're artful enough where you can say, well, here it is. This is proof that these people thought this way or this way about the Declaration, about the founding, about the revolution. They use the term revolution. And so that proves that Jaffa is correct.
Tamsel's huge collection of documents on the Constitutional Convention. I used to read that. I started reading that in high school because he had the documents. And yeah, there's a lot of undigested social contract language going around, but they don't all mean the same thing by it. They don't even sometimes seem to know what they mean by it. They just use it.
Right. I think that's the issue. The language at times, and people will do that even now. I mean, they'll say things that they don't even realize what they're doing or what they're saying. There's a deeper meaning to it, but they don't necessarily know what that is. And look, the founding generation were predominantly practical men. And when you look at the Declaration as a historical document, one thing that becomes clear is that when Jefferson wrote it in the format, it's the exact same format for the most part of the English Bill of Rights. It's an
Exactly.
indictment of
Right.
the king.
Right.
And this is what they knew, and this is what they had. It wasn't, and even Jefferson said it was an expression of the American mind. It wasn't anything new and radical in that way. It's just what they were thinking about. And it has that English antecedent to it, which is this format, this structure. The king's become dangerous. The parliament is complicit. We have to do something. We already have our own parliaments, our own legislatures, so we can govern ourselves. And so we don't need you anymore.
Yeah, and the strongest argument is that you have the assemblies in each colony. That's really a strong point. Is Jack Green's books on that very good.
Yes, I think Jack Green has done great work on this, and people don't know much about Jack Green either.
No, no.
He's not one of those historians that becomes front and center. I mean, he really would, in many ways, be in the antithesis of Jaffa in this ideological revolution, because essentially that's what Jaffa was saying. We had an ideological revolution similar to the French Revolution, and that would then carry forward into Lincoln. And Lincoln to Jaffa is an expression of Jefferson. Now, what's fascinating about that to me, and as I've gone back and read the old Federalists, and I find the New England Federalists to be interesting in some ways. In this way, in particular, they were very concerned about Jefferson being a Napoleonic figure, right? He was a military dictator, and if you can actually zing the Jaffaites with this. Okay, so if that's true, because they kind of like these old Federalists too, but if that's true, then if Lincoln is attached to Jefferson, is he the full expression of this Napoleonic military dictator that the Federalists worried about in the 18 teens when they were writing about Jefferson and Madison? Is Lincoln then that guy? Because clearly they said Jefferson's not it. Madison probably wasn't it. Was it then Jackson, or was it Lincoln that would get that? If that's the trajectory, does it fit that kind of profile moving out historically? I don't know what you think about that, but it's just something that,
Well, I think Jackson is interesting. You look at his proclamation against South Carolina, and you read Calhoun's comments on that. Calhoun predicted the kind of war that Lincoln would wage. He said it'll be a war of no quarter because he's calling it a rebellion, and we're merely talking about seceding or nullifying. And I don't know. There's that quote people like to use that George Washington, again, just throwing these ideas around, said, well, when people enter a social contract, individuals, they have to give up some of their rights. Well, you can say that if anything like that ever happened, but in 1787, you don't have individuals, you have states negotiating something. People don't seem to make that difference either, that distinction.
Mm-hmm.
So again, you already had political societies, as Don Livingston would call them.
Yes.
And relations between them aren't going to be the same as individuals. The other thing that always annoys me is the unanimity thing. They say, well, they were unanimous. Well, yeah, that's why they were there and they voted for it. But if we had 13 people in a club and had some rules for the club, are we bound to stay in that club forever? I don't know.
Right. Jefferson even used terms like accession and, in this, we were ceding to the document. That kind of term was used. So the opposite of that, of course, would be secession. And they all knew this was look. When you go in, if Jaffa's position that we have this indissoluble union, of course, we have these things, and this stuff is already out there, but not in the founding generation. The mere fact that George Washington openly worried about states not ratifying the Constitution because they didn't have to, and they could leave. Disunion was his greatest fear. Mm-hmm. Same thing with Edmund Randolph. If it wasn't possible, they wouldn't have worried about it, but they did worry about it because it could happen.
Edmund Morgan has this good book called Inventing the People. And in the book, I saw a review, and the reviewer said it was a great book. And I thought, okay, yeah, but who authorized Madison to invent a people? It was obviously a very good rhetorical trick to invent a people and then say that when the states ratified, which they do separately because they were separate states, they have somehow amalgamated the people. So it's just like the Treaty of Union between England and Scotland. And that's what James Wilson said, because he was a Scot and he approved of the union of England and Scotland. He wasn't one of your recalcitrant Scots. So he thought it was an incorporating union. There's nothing in the Constitution that suggests that it's an incorporating union. And Pocock points that out somewhere that that's one way to look at it. But I don't know. There's just so much confusion. Um, well, it can be cut through, and people have done it. I mean, Abel Upshur, there's no end to people. I mean, Davis, in volume one of The Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government, he's got a 90-page chapter on these questions. It's the best introduction I can think of.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Of course, the problem with Davis, when you suggest people read Jefferson Davis, well, he's just an apologist.
yeah,
And he's writing a lost cause apology. And so it's very difficult because of the pejoratives that are going to be used, the ad hominem attacks that, well, I mean, nobody takes this stuff seriously.
mm-hmm.
And they don't want to read it because of who wrote it. And so that then you create this issue. Well, Jefferson
Yeah.
Davis is just trying to make a case for himself.
Well, yeah, if we could write quote the people that hide their names.
Right. Yeah. I mean, well, how about, we can just go back and read the ratification debates because they talked about these things. But
Or if we could do secret reading ourselves, find the
right, yeah.
secrets.
Yeah. Put a book in, take the cover off, and just have the text, and you can just kind of, read what's there, and then tell me who wrote this. And
Yeah, claim it's a lost volume of Tom Paine.
right, right. So this, I mean, I think this is the key to understanding Jaffa. His end game. What do you think Jaffa's end game was? I mean, what do you think he really wanted to do by creating this proposition nation position? Lincoln being elevated to the founders. I saw that the Trump administration has released their new quarters for the anniversary, 250th anniversary, and they have, one quarter is, a patriot, one is, these symbols of the Declaration, and then Lincoln is there, right? So they have, these four quarters, essentially it's 5 quarters total. 4 are focusing on, something with the American War for Independence, and then you have Lincoln because he is the natural extension of these things. So what is Jaffa's end game? We don't have much time left, but what do you think his end game was in doing this?
I really don't know, other than fame and fortune, influence. They like influence. I really don't know. And he didn't. I don't know if he ever spent much time advising any politician other than Goldwater. So maybe he didn't want to be in the inner circles of power like the philosophers are supposed to be and be the power behind the throne. I'm not sure what his game was. Maybe he just enjoyed being a contrarian because his views were contrarian in the beginning. I don't know. I'll have to ponder that one.
Yeah, I don't know either. I mean, certainly, as I said, he's had a wide influence, um, larger than any of his opponents. I mean, and Mel Bradford has basically been buried. All the people that would be opposed to him are called all kinds. The paleocons have been run out of everything. So I think that some ways, Jaffa's position is attractive because Americans do want to feel good about the United States, and there is that part of it. We don't want to be told that our history is bad or we were bad here or there. And Jaffa allows you to have that kind of self-esteem. It's self-esteem history. Look, we're the good guys for everything.
Yeah, and in all these assaults in the last several decades, I'll say from the left, but it's not really a proper left. These aren't socialists with a conservative socialist program like the Labour Party used to be in England. These are these crazy postmodern loons, and they've been assaulting everything American and trying to take over. And for a lot of people, the Jaffite stuff being used by Trump and other people seems like the only defense or the only argument. And that's going to may explain part of the appeal. Certainly nobody wants to hear a Southern argument at the moment.
Yeah, and I don't know if the pendulum's going to swing back the other way. I mean, there's certainly people talking about trying to place this within context and still being proud of American history, but looking at it from maybe a different perspective. You've got certainly people that are interested in telling a different kind of story now, even in the mainstream. But that's what we wanted to do with the 1607 project, was kind of reorient things back to this position of a federalist with a lowercase f America, instead of this one people proposition nation myth. But we got about a minute, so if you just want to wrap up and any closing statement.
I had one, but I don't know if I can remember it now.
Okay.
Let me think. Well, I guess I'll have to do.
Okay. Well, Joe, it's been a pleasure to talk to you, and we're
Uh,
sorry you couldn't make it to the conference in the middle of March, but I did want to get you on here and have you give us a little taste of Harry Jaffa and his positions on the Declaration. We're going to get more of that in the conference itself.
okay, well,
We will
thank
have
you.
people talking about that, and we are going to record those. So, but the 250th anniversary is this year, so we're going to talk a lot about the Declaration, what it means, and how it how it relates to America in 2026. And so this is a vital conversation to have. So, Joe, thank you for your time, and thank you for everyone else coming out to this. Again, this is recorded, and so we're going to put it on YouTube to get a link to that. You can share it with your friends, and we can have more people think about Harry Jaffa and the Proposition Nation, and maybe another way of looking at the founding. So, Joe, I want you to have a very good evening. Everyone else have a good evening too.
Okay, you too, and thank you very much.
All right, see y'all later.